Back on the newsfeed PM now. Earlier this week, South Africa played host to the third G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting as the country continues its chairmanship. The meeting issued a communique reaffirming the need to reform the international tax system. While this has been hailed as a step in the right direction, there are ongoing discussions for more reforms in the global finance space. Joining me now to discuss this is Nkateko Chauke, the Interim Executive Director for Oxfam South Africa. Nkateko, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. Talk to us about what a fair global tax system would look like compared to what is currently there.
Great. Thank you so much, Hugo, for having me today on the show. The first thing I want to say is that the colonial legacy lives on. As we look at the outcomes of the finance ministers' meeting this week, there are several things to engage. One is that based on the outcomes of the Brazil G20 presidency in 2024, a historic deal was made there that really saw G20 leaders agree on a deal for a global agenda on tax. However, that global agenda on taxing the super rich falls silent with the current G20 presidency. And it hasn't taken on the full baton of, the milestones reached last year. Now, we also launched our Africa Inequality Report that really looked at the rise of the super rich. And the highlight of that report is essentially telling us a few things about the African context. And I'm saying this because Africa joins the G20 as a full member this year. And what we're seeing is that since 2000, the year 2000, Africa had no billionaires. And now Africa has accumulated 23 billionaires whose collective wealth is essentially 56% of wealth on the continent. This is all happening while 850 million people continue to experience hunger. And so that's why I referenced a colonial legacy that continues to perpetuate itself, while there is a real opportunity for the G20 this year to essentially take forward the gains that we had last year. So you ask, why is it important that we tax the super rich and amplify any messaging around that? Is, for example, for the African context, is that if you place a 1% tax on wealth and a 10% tax on income for the richest people on the continent, that combined wealth equates to $66 billion US per year. Now imagine what the African continent can do with that resources in terms of financing development, making sure that we have access to equitable health, education, social protection. That's all geared towards moving our people from destitution and addressing the fundamental issue, which is inequality.
What was the conclusion of the meeting on why the UN Tax Convention has not received the necessary support?
What we're seeing, Hugo, is also a over-reliance on ensuring that there is a lot of financing that's focused on private finance versus public finance. While the outcomes of the meeting were progressive in terms of moving G20 members or countries into a direction where these conversations are being had, we also need to look at the G20 as a continuum against other processes. You mentioned the UN Tax Convention, but also we have a roadmap to Belém with COP30 now, which is also still trying to unlock finance, particularly climate finance, in response to some of the issues that we are looking at. So when pushing for private finance. Essentially, we must be aware that private finance is essentially driven by private interests. That is making profit over the people and the planet. Whereas public finance is actually pushing for more grant-based funding that would see us advance our economies into development. So this becomes an issue when you see that the outcomes of the Financing for Development conference in Seville earlier on last month was really a silent take on the taxation agenda. While we have seen South Africa take bold steps to join the Pact for Action along with Brazil and Spain, we're also seeing contradictions within Brazil's position that's enabling conversations around private finance. And so when we're pushing for an agenda that looks at really raising the bar on tax reforms, but also dealing with the imbalances that have been enabled by global tax regimes until now, is also seeing that the G20 is not only a multilateral process, but it's a process that's linked to other engagements through UN processes as well.
The communique highlights the importance of the independence of central banks. What does that actually look like in practice?
Essentially, this must take into account the importance of domestic resource mobilization through taxes, and that's what we're calling for. What we've seen or are increasingly seeing is that developing countries, and particularly in the global south, are pushed by rich countries to essentially mobilize finance in ways that are regressive rather than progressive. With a value-added tax situation, it's not only South Africa, there are others in the global south who are pressed to function in this way. However, those have ripple effects in terms of the lived realities and the day-to-day economic participation and experience for people. So what we see is that we need to be advocating for processes that align with a global cooperation on tax that prioritizes raising the bar on income for taxing the super rich. And then secondly, also ensuring that the fiscus within countries, particularly in the global south, is really unburdened from cyclical debt, for example. And a lot of that conversation also took place in the African context with the conference that was held in Lome to ensure that Africa takes on a bigger push around debt cancellation, but also relieving the economic structures from the burdens that they're seeing. And that boils down to how finance or development finance is structured. And we are asking for a move towards grant-based financing vis-a-vis less on concessional loans.
Yeah. Do you still recognize an organization like the World Trade Organization as an important organization to address those issues?
Absolutely. I think there are some lessons that we can draw from what has transpired with the Trump administration, particularly the war on trade that we are seeing unfolding and affecting global South economies in particular. And so really ensuring that institutions such as the World Trade Organizations are not undermined, but also for the African context, as placing more of an emphasis on ensuring that we unlock the potential that sits within the Africa Free Trade Area Agreement will see us move towards regional economic integration, less on the export market, but leveraging our value chains within the African continent to then mobilize resources domestically and address our development issues, and particularly inequality.
So what kind of innovative approach do you think they need to take? You're saying there need to be some more innovative approaches to be more relevant and responsive in light of the realities that you mentioned happening, particularly in geopolitics.
Hugo, I cannot stress this enough. The first innovative approach is African countries taking a consolidated approach for pushing for a taxation on high net worth individuals, one. Two is also leveraging on our value chains from an economic point of view. Instead of us exporting our raw materials out into other economies, we could essentially build our infrastructure internally and therefore see our economies grow by capitalizing on our own currency in terms of the minerals that we see. We would then be able to also address issues around illicit financial flows. What we're seeing is money leaving the continent as opposed to money being generated from the continent. And I'm linking this to my statement where I mentioned that, we've accumulated 23 billionaires in 25 years on the African continent. And that for itself, if their combined wealth is 66 billion US dollars, that begins to tell us something that we need to look inward into our economies, leverage our value chains, rely more on our economies and less on export markets.
Nkateko, I appreciate your time. Nkateko Chauke, the Interim Executive Director of Oxfam South Africa, reacting to the communique issued at the conclusion of the third G20 Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting that took place in South Africa.